Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. Papa Boris here, playing some more chess. I'd like to show you a game here between two world champions, Mikhail Botvinnik playing the white pieces and Vasily Smyslov playing black. I wanted to show this game because both of these world champions have a reputation for a very dry, grinding style of play. And it's true that both of them were primarily positional players. Mikhail Botvinnik was a little more philosophically speaking, interested in identifying general principles to do well in chess. Vasily Smyslov was more of a pure player, just trying to find the best move in the position. But both of them were very positional. Neither one has a reputation for flashy tactics or romantic chess or anything like that. And I think to some extent, this results in a lot of their games being overlooked. You don't see a whole lot of Botvinnik or Smyslov games on YouTube, for example. And on top of that, they're just not as popular as the next world champion after them, Mikhail Tal, who is like the most beloved chess player of all time, from what I can tell. But what I found looking at their games is that there is a tendency to overstate the degree to which these players were positional and boring and grindy. And this game from the World Championship match in 1954 is a really good example of that. So this was a game in the World Chess Championship. These two guys were fighting for the title. Botvinnik was the incumbent, and Smyslov was the challenger. And I'm going to show another game of these two players, in which I'll talk more a little bit about the World Chess Championship system, which is basically a gigantic clusterfuck. But this introduction has already gone on long enough, so let's go ahead and start the game. Botvinnik chose d4. And after knight f6, c4, and g6, we have what could be called the Indian game. White decides to play g3, so that now both sides fianchetto their bishops. We got the fianchetto variation of the King's Indian variation of the Indian game. According to my engine, it might have some other titles. So a very straightforward opening. White gets some pawns in the center. Black is more interested in just setting up this kingside structure with just a castled king, and then waiting to see what white does before. Smyslov is more interested in castling as soon as possible, setting up that defensive structure on the king side, and just waiting to see what white does before committing any plans. After knight to c3, Smyslov decides on d6, letting his light-squared bishop develop, and maybe eventually supporting a push to e5 or to c5. Botvinnik carries on with natural developing moves, and Smyslov plays knight b to d7. Now this move does have some drawbacks. It blocks in the light-squared bishop from getting out, but it does help support the knight on f6 in case of any bishop to g5s. It also potentially can help support one of these pushes to c5 or to e5. So that's a fair number of reasons to eschew the usual knight to c6 developing move. Here, Botvinnik castles, and now Smyslov makes the push to e5. So how do you respond? Do you take? Do you push the pawn? Botvinnik decides to maintain the tension, and he plays e4. And now Smyslov here plays c6, getting ready to potentially push d5 at some point, also stopping any knight to b5 or knight to d5 maneuvers. Lots of positional play, as you can see here. And then Botvinnik plays bishop to e3, which is a slightly provocative move. It practically screams for black to play knight g4, threatening to attack and munch this bishop. But Botvinnik's idea was that now after knight g4, he plays bishop to g5. And so now what do you do as black? Do you move your knight back? That feels bad, because if here in this position white had played bishop to g5, then it would be black's move. But if we have this series of maneuvers, bishop to e3, knight g4, bishop to g5, and then knight to f6, it's the exact same position as if white had just moved here initially, only it's white's move. So it's just like throwing a move away. Feels bad. So Smyslov decides to push his queen to b6. We saw a move like this in the Fischer game. A common theme in these types of openings, it attacks two pawns at once. But there's a lot to consider here. This knight is a loose piece because the knight on d7 is blocking the bishop's protection of it. This knight is x-rayed by white's queen. If the knight on f3 moves, then the knight on g4 will be attacked. And it's also not really doing anything, this knight here. Plus, this knight is, in addition to blocking the bishop's protection of the knight on g4, it's just like stopping the bishop from developing, which is stopping the rooks from getting connected. So this is a very adventurous move by Smyslov here, contrary to his reputation as some old, dodger-stodger, because black has a lot of issues to be going after pawns. So here, Botvinnik decided to play h3, kicking this knight on g4, and Smyslov replied by capturing on d4. Again, this isn't just like some humble, I'm going to move my knight back or anything like that. He goes for a very active reply. E takes d4, so the idea is that now capturing this knight will be met with capturing white's knight. But to make this move, and again, this is a world championship match, to make this move, Smyslov had to figure that Botvinnik was going to see knight to a4, an intermediary move, getting the white knight out of the attack of the black pawn and attacking black's queen. The queen has to move, and now black's knight is taken. So black has straight up sacrificed a piece here for seemingly nothing. The plan that Smyslov had is that after his knight is captured on g4, which you really had to calculate all the way back here, right? Like all the way back here when you're playing e takes d4, you have to figure in on this knight move and then the queen move and then the knight being captured, and all the way from back to that position several moves ago, you had to calculate b5. Now, the idea is that this white knight now strangely has no moves. All the squares that that knight can move to are covered by black's pawns. So black will get the knight back, but this does take some time. Botvinnik decides to make use of his time by capturing on d4. And this is a very interesting move. Engines don't like it at first, but if you give the engine enough time to think, then eventually it actually quite likes white's position. So a pretty deep move by Botvinnik. So the idea is that, well, he's winning this pawn. That's a good thing. He's centralizing his knight. From d4, the knight is applying pressure to c6, which could be good in some cases. And Botvinnik knows that Smyslov doesn't really ever want to capture this knight with his bishop, because that would leave a whole bunch of gaping weaknesses, a bunch of dark squares that are open and no dark bishop to defend them. So here, Smyslov took the knight on a4. He's down a piece. He's got to get his piece back. And now Botvinnik's got the run of the mill here. And maybe the best move would have just been to play bishop to e7. This forks the rook on f8 and the pawn on d6. And after the rook moves, you just win the pawn. And it's fine. At this point, black has 6 pawns, white has 7 pawns, and additionally, black's pawn structure is just shattered. These is nasty over here. Now, white also has some nastiness as well with these doubled pawns, but it's nothing compared to black's. So this would have been a fine position for white because he has the extra material, and on top of that, his pawn structure is much better. But Botvinnik decided not to go for that just yet. He actually played a fairly adventurous move. He sacrificed a piece on c6. And again, I'm not saying that Botvinnik and Smyslov were like, laugh-a-minute thrill ride firecracker players. I'm just saying that the reputation that they have of being like stodgy people who never did anything except grind out boring games is not exactly accurate. Because here's two, stodger dodgers playing against each other, and this is pretty dramatic chess. Botvinnik didn't have to sacrifice his knight on c6. There was a perfectly obvious and a natural alternative plan that he could have played, but he decided to go for it here. So what's the idea with the sacrifice? Well, Smyslov takes it, and the idea here now is Botvinnik pushes e5. Notice now the queen is under attack by the bishop, and there's no way for the queen to move and protect this rook on a8 at the same time. So Botvinnik gave up a piece, but he gets a rook, and it's a whole rook. It's not just an exchange, but he's actually up a whole rook. And you have to wonder how deeply Smyslov analyzed this position, because it's possible that he actually saw all of this from many moves ago, or maybe he just rode with the punches. But in any case, he doesn't seem to be too bothered by white's sacrifice. He just happily munches the pawn on e5. And so now white's got choices. If we take stock of the position, white has 5 pawns to black's 6, but white is up the exchange. White has a rook for a knight. White could have just taken this pawn on d6. It wouldn't have necessarily been a bad thing, just, grabbing the pawn. The queen can't really easily be attacked because the bishop's looking at d8, plus d8's not protected, so the rook couldn't go there anyway. At this point, black would probably just play bishop to e6, attacking this bishop here, and the game would continue. But Botvinnik decided to play rook to c1. This is a logical move. It attacks the queen, and it puts white's rook on an open file with tempo. So there's definitely some logic to it. And here, Smyslov could have actually made a fairly tactical move. He could have played bishop takes g4, nabbing a pawn and counterattacking white's queen. So here, after rook takes c4, bishop takes d1. After this rook moves, now at this point, white would be, sorry, my phone is ringing and it's some random thing. I'm going to ignore it. At this point, White is still up the exchange. Black does have a passed pawn because this pawn was never taken by the queen. White's bishop is attacked, black's bishop is attacked, so it's a pretty dynamic position, and it could have gone either way from here. The engine gives this as being roughly equal. But Smyslov didn't go for that. He just, moved his queen, and from b4, the queen is protecting the pawn on d6, finally. And at this point, it's possible that Botvinnik misstepped a little bit. The thing is, this bishop over here is pretty crappy, and it wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world to just put this bishop back on g2 so it can defend White's king. But Botvinnik perhaps underestimated the significance, because, this does look like a fairly strong defensive structure, so perhaps he just didn't really fully appreciate the potential of the danger that he was in, and here is where he misstepped strategically. He first played a3, which in itself is not that bad, attacking the queen, and Smyslov decided to grab the pawn on b2. And now, again, Botvinnik should have really pushed this bishop back into a defensive space, either e4 or maybe g2. But Botvinnik here decided it was his turn to grab a pawn, and he grabbed this pawn on a4. And now comes one of the best moves in the game, in my opinion, from Smyslov. He played bishop to b7. And the reason I'm impressed by this move is that typically you'd expect somebody to be like, well, I'm going to go here, and then have an attack on this bishop. But what Smyslov realized is he doesn't really want a tempo. He doesn't want to develop a piece with tempo and then let White just put his bishop back on g2, which is what White should have been doing for the last couple of moves in the first place. He actually wants to eradicate that bishop completely. And so now the idea is that there's no way that this bishop's ever getting back to defend White's king. Now, Botvinnik here could have played bishop takes b7 and queen takes b7. And in this case, it is a very dangerous position for White. If White makes some, regular old move, like, I don't know, rook to d1, he's actually just losing the game right here because knight to f3 forks the king and the bishop. So, okay, fine, he doesn't just do that. He moves the bishop, so it's not going to get forked anymore. So he plays bishop f4. But this is still not good for White because after knight to f3 check, White's king is forced to get into this discover line from the white queen and the black knight. So just as an example, if White plays, say, king to h1, then black plays queen to d2 check, and then wins back the exchange. If White here plays king to g2, comedically he's actually just losing the game because knight to e1 is a double check. The king has to move, and no matter where the king moves, the queen now comes to g2, protected by the knight. And after the king moves again, we have a very picturesque checkmate, knight to f3. So just the queen and the knight coordinating around White's king can cause a surprising amount of trouble because of this pawn that was pushed in the opening, enabling a weakness on the f3 square. So when you hear people talking about weaknesses, it's not always just like a hypothetical thing. Sometimes it really actually makes a pretty big difference. But okay, so if this were to happen, if White would have taken the bishop and Black would have responded, but Botvinnik was probably good enough to realize that he's going to have to lose the exchange. The best way to do it is to play rook to c3. And now after knight to f3 check, Botvinnik would just sacrifice the exchange. And notice that now, because Botvinnik was up the exchange to begin with, he only just sacrificed the exchange back, and now the material is equal. And here the bishop could go to e7. There's that move we were talking about, forking the rook and the pawn, preventing the rook from coming to d8 to protect the pawn. And after the rook makes some move, now this is a very equal position. The material is exactly the same. The pawns are exactly the same. The pawn structures are very similar. This would probably have been a draw. And honestly, might not have been the worst thing for Botvinnik to take a draw, but he wanted to fight. So instead of going in for this drawing variation, he played rook to b1, which is a bold move. It does allow knight to f3 check, which Smyslov played. And here, White's not losing or anything, but Botvinnik started to make a couple of mistakes. So White has two choices to move his king, g2 or h1. And Smyslov, is a little bit ahead here no matter what Botvinnik chooses, but king to h1 is the incorrect choice of those two. King to g2 would have been better, and I'll show you why in a moment. So what happens now is, Smyslov actually sacrifices his queen. He plays bishop takes a8. And this allows the queen to be captured by Botvinnik's rook. But now you'll notice that this rook on b2 is actually attacked by the bishop. And on top of that, Smyslov can play knight takes g5, capturing a piece with check. This, by the way, is why white's king should have been on g2, because then Botvinnik could have stopped any more shenanigans by playing f3. Here, f3 can just be captured. Well, in any case, after king to h2, Smyslov plays knight to f3 check, forcing the king around some more, and after the king moves, then he grabs this rook on b2. So at the end of the day, when the smoke is cleared, black actually has 3 minor pieces for the queen, which is enough. A queen is worth about 3 minor pieces. And this is perhaps what Botvinnik missed way back here when he played rook to b1. He might not have counted on Smyslov's ability or willingness to actually sacrifice his queen through this sequence, and then pick up both a bishop and a rook for that queen. So now black is decidedly better because black's pieces are very well coordinated, and it's not hard for Smyslov to basically set up a fortress and leave everything protected and then start carrying out his plans. So Botvinnik tries to make it happen. He takes on a7 with the idea that maybe he'll push this past pawn, but it just ain't going to happen. So first, Smyslov plays bishop to e4, getting the bishop out of the corner. After Botvinnik pushes the pawn, Smyslov plays king to g7 to make sure that there's never any shenanigans with checks on the back row. The dark squared bishop is covering this diagonal, so the white queen can never give checks here. Then we have rook to d1, trying to get that d6 pawn, but that's really kind of a wasted move because bishop to e5 is a great square for the bishop. The knight is blocking the f4 pawn from chasing the bishop away, and the bishop is protecting the pawn's protecting the bishop, and everything is just hunky as well as dory. So here, Botvinnik played queen to e7. It's not a good move, but I mean, he's losing the game no matter what. It's just a matter of how he wants to lose. The move doesn't really do anything, but what is there really for white to do? Smyslov's way of finishing this game up is quite instructive. So he plays rook to c8, and after Botvinnik continues to push the pawn, he gets the rook down to the 7th rank. So rooks in the 7th rank are a beautiful thing. Now this pawn is under attack, and I guess the best way to protect it would have been to play queen to a7 and protect it this way. But again, white is losing no matter what he does, so it's just a matter of how. Botvinnik decided to protect the pawn with king to d2, of course putting the king in the line of fire of this light squared bishop yet again. Smyslov played knight to d4 check, and after the king moved away, he put the bishop on f3. So the idea here is that Smyslov is actually weaving a mating net for the white king. After rook to b1, Smyslov played a very innocent move, knight to c6, and believe it or not, Botvinnik here actually resigned. So what's the problem? The point of this move is not just to harass the white queen or even to really take this pawn on a5. The point is actually to vacate the d4 square for the bishop so that a mating net can be developed. Let's say, for example, that white were to play queen to c7, protecting this pawn on a5. What would happen then is black would play bishop to d4, and now there's no way to stop this rook from coming to f2. And it's a little bit deep. It's kind of actually hard to see how this is going to work, but Smyslov made a very deep finish to this game. Let's say white tries to keep pushing the pawn. What's going to happen is rook to f2 check. And the idea here is to engineer a situation in which the rook can come to g2 and then to g1, where it's protected by the bishop, and checkmate the white king on the back row in such a way that the two bishops are covering all of the squares in front of the king. So for example, if the king tries to run to e1, then what we'll have is rook to e2 check, king to f1, let's say, and now rook to g2. And at this point, rook to g1 checkmate is threatened. If the king goes to e1, the bishop comes to e3. And now again, the bishops are covering all the squares in front of white's king. This bishop is covering the white king's ability to move any further, and if the king runs back the other way, well, that doesn't make any difference because the g1 square is protected by the dark squared bishop. So a very clever mating net here by Smyslov. So white would have to make a move here like queen to g5. And the idea here is, in that variation I just showed you, to stop the black bishop from being able to go on e3, or it cuts off the d2 square for the white king. And here, because black has taken care to protect all his stuff, and there's no shenanigans, black can just take this pawn. And once that pawn is gone, white's got nothing. Black is ahead in material because the 3 minor pieces are better than the queen. Black has this passed pawn. Black has white's king on the ropes. There's just no way of getting out of this situation. So in any case, after knight to c6, Botvinnik with the white pieces and reigning world champion resigned. So a very strong victory for Vasily Smyslov. Thank you so much for watching this game. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another game between these two world champions and talk more about the world championship process in my next video. Take care, everybody.